This is the Open University.
Welcome to the Open University, where I'm being chased by a white cockroach. This is my new robot friend. Incredibly stupid machine. It's meant to have some kind of intelligence and to make patterns on the floor as it cleans. It's a D-bot by Ecovacs, and it's some kind of vacuum robot, obviously. I watched it for about 10 minutes yesterday as it had been instructed to return to its charging station and didn't realize that it was trapped under a table and kept bumping into the table legs. All it would have had to do is go... I'm going to switch it off. All it would have had to do was reverse. It doesn't have a camera. I think the more expensive ones have cameras and kind of superior intelligence. This has an IQ of about 3, I would say. It's less intelligent than a cockroach, than an amoeba even. There's a collective intelligence to a lot of animals, even monocellular beings, which this lacks, because it can't learn. It couldn't. There was no way it could learn to reverse out of the table and then to go towards its charging station. It only had the idée fixe to go straight to the charging station. Anyway, welcome back to the Open University. There's been a bit of a break because I was in Paris with my girlfriend, fiancée / lover for 10 days, and helping her to establish a new apartment in a wonderful square overlooking a market. So really kind of doing what I was doing here in Berlin last year when I was, from July onwards, I had to re-establish semi-permanent roots in a place and haul my stuff out of storage and get my library back together. Then I plunged, of course, straight into making a record, and then I plunged straight into making this memoir, which I'm writing for Farrar, Straus and Giroux in New York, which is tentatively titled Niche. And last time I was talking about sort of biographical things that I was writing in that, but I found that that's not very helpful, actually. It's a bit confusing for me because I find myself thinking, now have I discussed this anecdote as part of my student life, for instance, in a video, or was it in the book itself? So it really clutters my mind, and I don't want to talk again about that. I'm now in the 80s. I'm describing the 1980s, which is a sort of fascinatingly awful decade, but also where I have my career roots as a musician, as Momus. But what I do want to talk about today is an article I was writing yesterday for an art magazine. One of my regular gigs is writing for an Italian art magazine called Moose. And they have a special Venice issue coming up, which will coincide with the opening of the Venice Art Biennale in, I think, May or June. So they wanted me to write about my personal experiences of Venice. And I found myself doing what I often do in these kind of think pieces, or indeed in my my whole life, which is that I think about a place as an exception to the rule. Venice is very much the exception to the modern world. It's a very exceptional city because it has no cars, first of all, and because it seems to be a city from the past which has been preserved in aspect, but of course it's not. It's a very modern city with Wi-Fi and airports and everything else. But it's preserving many of the aspects of some of the best aspects of the cities of the past. You don't actually have bubonic plague and cholera anymore, as you do playing around the edges of Venice in St. Thomas Mann's story, Death in Venice, where cholera outbreaks are very imminent, and actually the main character, von Aschenbach, dies of cholera in the end. But you do have, a protection from motor vehicles and other things. But what I always find myself asking in these cases of looking at an exceptional thing is this a kind of standing reproach to the world as we know it and to life as we know it? And also, if this is so different, is it something we can learn from or something we are teaching? So when you go to Venice, let's say you go to, or any beautiful old medieval city, or a city without cars, or an island like Sark, which has no cars, could be another example of this. Do you come away do you uglify it with your modernity, or do you come away somehow permanently changed, adjusted to, let's say, the kind of city life of 200 or 300 years ago? And need that even be something we locate in the past? Is Venice's essential difference something simply about preserving the past, or is it something to do with the future? Perhaps we will live in the future in cities without cars once more. This car period will simply have been a sort of aberration which lasted a century or so, and which we realized the mistake of. And cars will be eradicated in various ways. They'll become autonomous, they'll join up, they'll become trains, they will go underground, they'll go in hyperloop tubes. All sorts of things can happen in the future which will actually make our cities a bit more like Venice. Another thing I was talking about in this essay was pseudo-Venices, simulacra of Venice. There are several throughout the world. There's, of course, in Las Vegas, there's various little canals and things around the glitzy hotels in Las Vegas, but most simulacra Venices are in China or Japan. The most realistic one is probably in the Disney Sea Resort in Tokyo, just outside Tokyo, which has all the kind of textural patina of the real Venice. And of course, the real Venice has a kind of theme park aspect. So, even in that sense, it's not so dissimilar. You don't actually have to pay to get in, not yet anyway, to get into the centre of Venice. But it is very much a theme park. And actually, that seems to be the way cities are going. Edinburgh, for instance, now has actual permanent physical gates around the city centre. It started off as something that only happened in the Hogmanay celebrations at New Year. We had a big Scottish party at New Year's Eve, and it used to be a wild free-for-all that would just happen across the centre of the city with really very little control from the police or the authorities, and certainly no spectacle. Now there's fireworks, and you get Delamitri, you get my cousin playing a concert or something, and it's gated and ticketed. So I think you actually have to pay a fee to get into the city centre at Hogmanay, and maybe also at the festival they do some gating. So this is a tendency, a sort of retro-medieval tendency, if you like, to do some kettling, what the police call kettling, where you sort of section off a problematical area of the city where people are being a little bit too riotous, and you control people's entry and exit. So Venice is no doubt on its way to that. The whole European Union is also possibly on its way to that, because we read in the papers I read today that there might be a fee of €7 to get in. Depending on the various possible outcomes of the Brexit process, there might be a fee of €7 for British people to get into Europe, as if Europe were a great theme park for their holidays, rather than what it is for me, for instance, which is a place to live. But it might actually, if there's a no-deal Brexit, it might be something like €54 to get in for a 90-day period to Europe. I mean, these are shruggy fees for me. It doesn't really make any difference to me whether I have to pay a little money or not. It wouldn't change my plans. I wouldn't go back and live in Britain because of some trifling fee. But it does sort of give this picture of Europe as a fortress Europe, as we used to call it. So my wider question is, do these exceptional gated cities confirm the general rule of modernity, or do they actually challenge it simply with their difference? And this is an essential political question for me, whether difference in itself, diversity, pluralism, is a political value, and whether any difference which one encounters can serve as a standing reproach to the existing order, to the status quo. And of course this has implications for the kind of musician I am, which is an indie musician, an independent musician. I often think, it would be so horrifically depressing to measure our importance as indie musicians by saying, by sales units or by the normal criteria of success, because we tend not to have that, not to have much of it at all. But how we justify our existence is to provide an alternative, as if that were in itself a virtue, to say, look, it doesn't have to be that way. That music industry where everybody's opportunistic and greedy for money and, synthetic and shrill, is opposed by our world, where everything is more kind and liberal and authentic. If that world is inauthentic over there and opportunistic, then we are authentic and genuine and actually non-materialistic or post-materialistic, as I've often portrayed myself. despite buying gadgets like robot hoovers. So the question is that a political virtue in itself? And I tend to think it is. I tend to think that anybody providing a genuinely different vision is doing you a service. But I can't really ignore the idea that there isn't really an exception. We live in a kind of monoculture where there is only one way of thinking about things, and the old saw about the exception proving the rule comes into play here, that the exception proves the rule in the sense that it encodes all the logic of the status quo, even in its apparent rejection of that logic. So I think there would be a strong case to make to say that the indie rock of the 1980s was simply encoding the same values as mainstream rock in a slightly different register, or even in its very rebellion against those values, it was confirming them. Just as identity politics, I think one of the greatest failings of a very much failing system of identity politics, with its internecine sibling rivalries and its minor schisms and endless hatreds and all the rest of it, witch hunting and the things we see on a daily basis. One of its great failings is that it encodes all the worst prejudices. Anti-racism encodes all the prejudices of racism. For instance, you often see a picture of monkeys, and then people say this is a racist image, don't use this image of monkeys. And why would that be racist? Only if you held the racist idea that black people are like monkeys. That would be considered a racist image on its own. So in order to... And you could imagine a scenario in which people never actually encountered, in their echo chambers, they never encountered actual racism. They would only encounter the reactions to racism, which are apparently right on and politically correct, and that they would learn their racism or their sexism or their anti-Semitism by people apparently negating those things. That would still be a way to learn that, say, black people were supposed to look like monkeys. If that idea had never occurred to you in the first place, it would still be there in a kind of prohibition. So it's the wider idea that all prohibitions encode. And this is, of course, we should get into Bataille here. Where's my Bataille collection? Georges Bataille, very much a proponent of the idea that prohibition and celebration are kind of the same thing, and that transgression is kind of act of making love to the law itself. The obscenity laws, for instance, encode obscenity, and actually, the transgression and the law itself are two sides of the same coin, as it were. So that's a kind of profoundly deterministic view. I'm not sure what I think of that whole idea. I think it obviously is a problem. It does imply there is no freedom of choice, though. It sort of implies that we're culturally very much bound to the monologic of our monoculture. And so what would my whole life as an independent musician have added up to then, if I was simply an expression of the mainstream? Well, on the one hand, I would probably be slightly flattered that I was so mainstream after thinking I was so marginal. But on the other hand, I would think that this whole notion of a virtue being encoded in this difference as a political thing would have been a waste of time, that it would have been like a painted backdrop in a restaurant, in a food court, where it looks like you're actually on the third basement level with just air conditioning ducts and a lot of escalators and things. But there are paintings of sort of Italian terraces and patios and tumbling roses and things, and beautiful views out over Lake Como. And so what we as sort of alternative writers or musicians, or even people who write articles for art magazines, what we've been doing is giving you the idea, the sort of refreshing idea, that there is an alternative view and that there is a different way of doing things. And in fact, we've been lying to you, but it's just, it's a brick wall. We didn't have to make that little mural there. So, maybe it did improve your life, though. The idea that there could be people making Edwardian or vorticist cabaret records in 1992, as I did with the Ultraconformist, for instance, was sort of moderately refreshing for record consumers at the time, because not many people were doing that. Our eccentricity actually made life better for you guys. So that's something I'm thinking about. I'm thinking, first of all, I'm thinking, can we learn from Venice? Because obviously there is something in the idea of brainstorming, for instance, that if you come up with, or uses for objects, these traditional tests of creativity do imply that there is something useful about having as many different possibilities in front of you, deals on the table, as the Brexit people say, as you can have, so that you have at least the illusion of choice. Of course, what we find with Brexit is that they're all illusory. People have been describing them as, the sort of the unicorn deal, or the pixie dust deal, or whatever, because they aren't real possibilities, and we know that there's actually a brutal simplicity to the choice that Britain has, which is either to remain or to crash out. It doesn't seem like there's, at the moment anyway, there's much alternative. There isn't a range. Taking no deal off the table has been a big political hot potato. Who knows if it's even possible, because it is the default option in the paperwork that we've signed up to. No deal is what we will default to in March. I'm blithe about it, but I'm obviously in a very vulnerable position here, and living in Europe as a British person living in Europe. I don't know what my citizenship will be in simply a month or two's time. I don't know what rights I will have, what medicine I'll have access to. Luckily, I don't need any medicine at the moment, but I'm not as young as I used to be, so I obviously will need medicine at some point. Dentistry and all the rest of it. You want me to flash you a grin and show you the state of my teeth? I'm sure you don't. But at least my bad teeth do give you a picture of an alternative to American orthodontics. Yes. So I obviously remain wedded, while realizing how problematical it is, I remain wedded to the idea of providing people with a series of alternative possibilities. And that's actually one of the things that moves me most if I go to, say, an avant-garde dance or theatre performance, or something terribly Berlin, like somebody playing a tuba through a piezo mic and it coming out like the sound of balloons being scratched or whatever. I think that that sense of freedom, that it could be total self-indulgence on the part of the performers, but it gives me, as a consumer of that sort of weird performance, it gives me a sense of freedom and possibility, that if they're allowed that latitude of freedom, I could also be allowed it. So what they're doing is demonstrating something which I think John Cage talked about a lot, which is the anarchism as the demonstration of freedom, and the idea of a radical transvaluation of all values. That John Cage took it from Buddhism, that every day is a good day. That was one of his favorite phrases. Every day is a good day. There are no higher and lower values. There are no better and worse days. There is no better or worse music even, although, of course, John Cage did think some music was better than other music. He didn't like music that was too organized and too tight, too patterned, too repetitive, too stereotypical. But he could hear that music being played on a transistor radio on the beach, for instance, and then hear it in a general soundscape, and then start paying attention to other things and see a radical equality of. I mean, this is toxic in some ways, because of course aesthetics is not about radical equality at all. It's about saying, I like this combination of colours and not that combination of colours, this combination of sounds and not that. So it's something I haven't resolved myself, and that's always the most interesting kind of question. Is Venice a standing reproach to London, for instance? Does one go from London to Venice and then come back to London and say, hey, listen, we could do something a bit more Venetian here. Let's, develop the canals. We have canals in London. Let's go to Maida Vale and do something, just around the back of Paddington Station, which is a bit Venetian. And I think you do see some of that happening. This is one of the pluses of cosmopolitanism and of globalization, that people have come back from various holidays and various trips abroad with some of the best ideas and executed them in microscales usually. They haven't made the whole city of London into Venice, but they've made little bits. The Little Venice, there is literally a Little Venice in Maida Vale, isn't there? So I think it's, and maybe you could say the same about some mainstream pop stars have actually listened to my records and have taken a bit of my eccentricity and my kind of weird spirit into their music. And, I know that that's been the case. I'm not going to name names, but I think I've had little bits of influence here and there. So I think it is, for me, it's still a value. It's still worth... I'm not such a cultural determinist that I think there's only the monoculture and then negation of the monoculture, which is a nihilistic negation which leads nowhere. I think that would be a very sad picture. That picture of the food court on the second or third basement, which is simply decorated with murals. That's really all I wanted to say today. I guess I'm going to go back to my vacuuming. I don't actually have to do any work. I just let this machine do the work for me. But of course, I'm like a Jewish mother, to be stereotypical and racist about it. I'm sort of breathing down its neck the whole time. It's actually stuck. I don't think it wants to keep vacuuming. What it does is it sends me emails when it's stuck and says, I am stuck, or I have lost contact with the ground. It reminds me of my rabbit, actually, because it's humping the divider between the two rooms here. My rabbit used to hump everything, and it also used to gnaw all the paper and the book jackets on the ground level, and gnaw through the cables as well. It didn't get electrocuted for some reason, but almost did. It did it very quickly, so I think it bit through the cables too fast to get electrocuted. Anyway, I'm here with my only friend. Consider me happy.